This just in, President Lincoln suspends habeas corpus, call forth a militia without congressional approval, blockaded the South with hundreds of warships, is enlarging the Army and Navy to the tune of $2 million. He's ordered armament and ordnance without congressional approval. He has authorized a confiscation of property for war. He has issued an Emancipation Proclamation declaring that slaves in the territories of rebellion are now free. He has allowed military courts to try citizens outside of the civil jurisdiction. He has declared that the president is more powerful than the courts and the Congress. He has ordered the arrest and execution of some traitors. He believes that his first job as president is to preserve, to protect, and defend the Union. This lecture is about presidential authority during the Civil War. So what I just read forth to you in news report fashion was the litany of violations of the position of president that were committed by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And in retrospect, we might argue that these issues and these events and his actions as president were justified. But we also have to examine, were they legitimate? Did he have constitutional authority in order to act on these actions? And although after he is assassinated, the Congress and the courts are really going to control the government for the next 40 years, until we get to World War I almost, because I feel the Congress is going to see the writing on the wall that if the president gains too much authority, then the Congress loses its power. And seeing that the Congress is the elected body, directly by the people, that's supposed to really represent the interests of the people, whereas the president, still at this point, is not truly elected by the people. I mean, it's elected indirectly through this very complicated presidential election system, and the Congress is really the one who should be making the laws. The president's there to enforce the laws. So this is a question of presidential authority. This is a question that we talk about even in the modern day. What authority does the president have outside of the laws that have been created for them? So let's take a couple of these points and think about what was the violation and how did this influence the position of president in future generations? So in 1861, Fort Sumner is the last bastion of Union territory in South Carolina. South Carolina has declared secession from the Union. And it's something that it's just so interesting to think about, that you're in a state and the state has declared it's no longer part of the United States. However, the military installations are federal territory. So technically, you can't take those territories and incorporate them into your newly seceded state because they're not yours to take. They are federal lands. And by taking federal lands, you technically are invading American soil. So you're not only just breaking away of your own territory, you're also taking land that doesn't belong to you. So the argument here is Lincoln is presented with the fact that Fort Sumner is going to be captured, and Fort Sumner is federal land. So his belief again is preserve, protect, and defend the United States, all the land of the United States, including federal land. So when Buchanan did very little in order to intervene in this case and allowed South Carolina to secede from the Union, Lincoln was a little more interested in seeing how the South would react if he tried to supply them with supplies, food, and armaments and such. So instead of declaring the action to be heinous and sending in soldiers to attack South Carolina, in many ways Lincoln wanted the Fort Sumner to be attacked, because then he could justify the fact that here's the South invading the United States, we need to take action in order to preserve the Union and bring South Carolina back into our fold. Now, Lincoln is going to order a blockade of the South. He's going to order an increased funding to the Army and the Navy. And he's going to do this without the support of Congress. So Congress is not going to actually authorize the expenditures to this military intervention. Now, up to this point, Congress had been central in authorizing. In the Mexican-American War, in the War of 1812, Congress had to authorize the funds that were going to be spent on this intervention based on the beliefs of the majority. When you get to the Civil War, Lincoln has taken it upon himself to decide this is a crisis that needs executive authority to intervene. So, does the president have the authority to intervene, was the question. And from Lincoln's perspective, he was following his job. From the Congress's perspective, he was not following the chain of command because Congress technically has the authority to send money and to give money to presidential endeavors. Now we get to other acts that Lincoln created, like the Emancipation Proclamation, where in 1863 he decides that he's going to free slaves. Now technically he's not freeing slaves in the Union, because the slaves of West Virginia and Missouri and the border states, Kentucky, these states, their slaves were not freed. But the states that were south of those states, the states in rebellion, those slaves would be freed. So as the Union was capturing more and more territory back from the South, the people, these slaves in those states, would therefore get independence, would get freedom as those states were liberated. Now the problem with this is he is taking away the property of Southerners, who he considers still to be part of the United States, and he's not taking away the slaves from all slaveholders. So he's first of all making decisions as to who can lose their property, because at this point slavery is still valid. I mean, it's still property. You're taking property away from citizens. So even if he brings the whole South back into the Union, by freeing those slaves, he's removing property from private citizens, and therefore he is violating their freedom of property ownership as in the Constitution. And then we get to the point where the military trumps the civil courts. So in 1861, to start off with, Lincoln, he suspends habeas corpus in Baltimore when there are the Pratt Street riots going on. And he starts arresting people and not giving them why they were arrested, and not giving them a fair and speedy trial, not giving them, reading them their rights. Not that rights were read ceremoniously like they were after the Miranda Law, but none of the effects of the Bill of Rights about the legal way that you're supposed to arrest somebody and put them on trial had to be followed when the habeas corpus was suspended. Now, Lincoln believed this was in the best interest of America, because he said that in times of war, we must suspend certain things, the military must intervene, and we must come to some sort of peace before we can reinstitute our normalcy. Did he have the right to take rights away from citizens that were against him? Again, it's an argument that there are two different sides to the argument. You have your constitutional scholars who argue he had no right to do what he did, but had he not done that, then would he have been able to bring peace quicker, as quick as he did? The other argument says, yes, the president has the authority because the president has to protect, preserve, and defend the United States. And whatever he needs to do in order to do that, that is what he should do. Now, obviously, that's less of a majority opinion, but that was the opinion of many radical Republicans. The president should have that authority. So here we start to have, looking at one of our course outcomes, thinking about the development of politics. Now, is it fair that a president has a massive amount of authority? Because that president represents a party, and therefore that party gets more power than the other party. Now, is that to be said that if a president has ultimate power, and that party should have ultimate power as well? I mean, it's an argument that's out there. The president's always going to give more influence to a party, but if the president controls the party and the Congress and the Supreme Court, don't we have a dictatorship? Because we have no balance of power. Should the president maybe be apolitical? Some people have brought up. The issue with presidential authority that comes out of the Civil War is the president got too powerful. And for the next 40 years, there'd be systems put in place in order to limit the presidential authority. And they would run presidents who really were not power hungry, who really couldn't gain too much power over Congress. Congress specifically chose people who were middle of the road. They may have been strong in their passions about what they believe in, but they weren't willing to go against Congress in the same way that Lincoln was. So the lesson to be learned from presidential authority in the Civil War is, although we don't have a definitive answer, we can't say was President Lincoln a criminal for what he did. Some would argue that, obviously. What we can say is that President Lincoln did something that had not really been done in the presidency. He assumed powers to fulfill his job. And because it was in the middle of a crisis, many supported his actions. In retrospect, maybe people didn't agree with him, but at the time, it was believed that what he did was in the best interest of America. So that question is something that we're going to think about. Is it okay for the president to do something that typically might be illegal if it's in the best interest of the safety of Americans? And that's the lesson that we can think about. That's the question we can think about that comes from this Lincoln presidency.